and I was just getting up the learning curve. And then I received this phone call, and I was asked to go see the clerk of the Privy Council. So he's basically the Prime Minister's deputy minister. He's the top public servant in the country. And there are only a couple of reasons why you get a call from the clerk. One of them is because you've done a bad job and they want to talk to you. Another is they're giving you a promotion. And I knew it was neither of those, so I was a little unclear as to what it was about. So I was very curious. I arrived in his office the next morning, and he explained that the Prime Minister will be visiting Washington, seeing the President of the United States. And one of the issues they were going to discuss was coming to a new agreement on border security. And they wanted me to lead the negotiations with the U.S. on this agreement, and that I was to accompany the Prime Minister to the White House. One of the things that people don't necessarily recognize is that, there's always a purpose to the meeting. It's always announced that, the leaders are going to meet to discuss X, but often they discuss a range of other things. So my recollection of the meeting, it's a couple of years ago now, was that obviously the border security issue was one of the things they talked about, but it was one amongst a number of other issues. But that was the meeting. That meeting in February was the formal launching of the process. So I arrived back in Ottawa Thursday afternoon, and the leaders had indicated that they wanted to move quickly. There was talk, that we were to have this done in 6 months, 3 to 6 months. And at this point, I had no team. I had just been given the assignment a few days earlier. This is an area, border security, with a lot of different agencies involved, a lot of ministers, a lot of my colleagues in the senior bureaucracy. So my feeling at the time, I'm somebody who's very uncomfortable being behind the eight ball. I like to kind of feel like I have at least a game plan. And so I'd returned from this meeting in Washington figuring that I had to get a game plan together very quickly. And so basically I spent the Friday and then the Saturday, Sunday, over the weekend placing a whole lot of phone calls to former ambassadors, to senior executives in the private sector, to officials in the government who had worked with the Americans before. I basically tried to soak up as much knowledge as possible in the space of 2 or 3 days to try to get at least some sense of what my game plan would be. Well, I had a couple of priorities. One of them was I wanted to have at least a conceptual sense of how I was actually going to run these negotiations. How would I work with the U.S. Government people? What would be the kinds of priorities we'd pursue? How would we even select the priorities? So I wanted to have a sense of, I'm a policy-oriented person, and so I immediately think of what is the framework, the conceptual framework I'm going to operate under. So I wanted to get that nailed down. I had to put together a team. I had to identify people and pull together a team. I needed to find a source of money for a budget. We had to have some office space, at least for a short period of time, to house people. I was acutely aware that there were a lot of different players in Ottawa who had a role in this, and my role was, I wouldn't say it was ill-defined, but it was only, basically defined. I was the guy who was supposed to lead this process, but apart from that, I was somebody who was outside the system. I was the Associate Deputy Minister of Industry Canada, so I'm the number 2 guy in the Industry Department. The Industry Department doesn't actually have a lot to do with border management. I was to report to the Prime Minister. Well, in the Industry Ministry, I actually have a minister. So in the chain of command, I actually report to a minister, and that minister reports to the Prime Minister. So I had this, kind of title. I was to be the chief negotiator. I was to report to the Prime Minister. I was to pull together a deal on border security. But if you look on paper, actually, I report to someone else. The expertise in my ministry doesn't deal with the border. And there are a lot of other players, a lot of other cooks in the kitchen. So one thing I was acutely aware I had to get pulled together fairly quickly was some sense of accountabilities. How was I to work in the system? How was I to work with my colleagues? What would be the role of the Prime Minister's office? What would be the role of the Privy Council office, which is the bureaucracy that supports the Prime Minister? I had to define my relationship to all these people, and fairly quickly, because otherwise there would be a lot of cooks in the kitchen and it would be very confusing. I think I was fortunate to get good advice early on from a number of people. I did make an effort early on to talk to a lot of knowledgeable individuals to avoid some of the mistakes of the past, to try to build on things that had worked. And as a result, very early on, I came up with a couple of elements that I think I considered and that other knowledgeable people that I respected considered were essential to success. So the first one was to get clear accountabilities in place. Who was responsible for what? What was my role? Who did I report to? How was my relationship going to work with all the other important actors in the system? And we basically, we sketched that all out up front early on, and I got agreement from the top, people, the clerk of the Privy Council, my deputy minister colleagues. We got agreement very early on that, that the reporting structure and how I was to work, that was all agreed in advance. So when I was halfway through the project, I didn't have confusion about who was supposed to be doing what. The second thing is that I worked with the business community and with the national security community, in official Ottawa, to identify early on what we saw as the list of the most important issues to address at the border. And we were quite deliberate in picking a list that we felt was manageable. We agreed early on we would have perhaps 24 items, maybe a few more, and that once we had the list and once we agreed with the U.S. on the list, that list was locked. And we weren't going to take anything away, and we weren't going to add anything unless truly there was some really, really compelling reason. Because one of the things I learned from previous exercises is that you started with a list that was manageable, and it wound up growing and growing and growing as more people wanted to add their own pet projects onto the list. So we picked what we thought were the most important issues. We were quite deliberate not to pick issues that were too ambitious. I mean, we actually made a deliberate decision not to try to bite off more than we could chew. So we tried to calibrate the areas we worked on to focus on things where we actually thought we could make real progress and actually achieve something real. And the other thing I would note was, and again, this is something that I learned early on and we built into the process, we agreed with the Americans that we wouldn't put anything on the list if we weren't going to put an outcome that we expected to get, what was the actual achievement we would get, and that we would actually commit to that on paper. If we weren't willing to actually specify which agencies were in charge, and we weren't going to put a date against it. So we came up with a list that was fairly compact. We actually thought we could make progress. And for every item in the list, we had somebody responsible, a date when it was supposed to be done, and an actual outcome that was supposed to be measured and achieved, and which would be reported to the public.